My name is Caroline Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, where I run a small but growing business restoring antique furniture. It's quiet work, methodical, and full of patience, skills I've learned to value more with time. I live alone in a brick townhouse I bought last year with a little herb garden out back and a workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and citrus oil. For most of the year, my life is calm, measured, predictable. But once a year, I cross state lines and return to Illinois for the family's Thanksgiving gathering. I thought I had prepared myself for this year. I thought things would be different. I thought they might feel different. I was wrong. Because this year, my uncle stood at the head of the table and gave a toast. And at the end of it, he looked directly at me. Not with warmth, not with welcome, but with the kind of finality that doesn't need volume to be deafening. He raised his glass and said words I had never expected to hear from a man who once taught me how to ride a bike. He said I didn't belong there. No one stopped him. No one defended me. The only thing louder than his words was the silence that followed. It was a silence that wrapped itself around my chest like wire, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. If you've ever been publicly erased by the people who helped raise you, if you've ever walked into a room full of your own blood and felt like a stranger among them, then I think you'll understand why this story has to be told. But before I take you through the unraveling, I want to ask one thing. If you've ever experienced something like this, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how many of us are out there, the ones they pushed aside, the ones they left out, the ones who stayed quiet too long. Please like this video, subscribe, and help me build a place for our stories to be seen and heard. Because this wasn't just about a toast. It never is. These moments don't come out of nowhere. They're the final note of a song that's been playing under the surface for years. My story, like most, didn't begin with betrayal. It began with hope. Thanksgiving had always been complicated for me, even before this. Growing up, I was the niece who lived far away, even though we were just 2 states over. My parents divorced when I was 7, and my mom moved us to Colorado, leaving most of her family behind in Illinois. Holidays became a rotation. 1 year with my dad's side, 1 year with my mom's. My mom's side, the side where the toast would one day happen, was the louder one, the bigger one. 5 siblings, 4 married, 3 with kids, cousins who grew up within minutes of each other. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Group photos I usually took instead of appearing in. They were never unkind, at least not overtly. But I always felt like an afterthought, a guest, a seasonal visitor to a club I wasn't quite a member of. Still, I kept coming back. I wanted to belong. I craved it more than I could admit, especially after my mom died when I was 25. She had been my anchor, my translator in family dynamics I never quite grasped. After her death, the invitations became fewer, the phone calls less frequent. But every couple of years, someone would text in early November asking if I was making the trip this year, and I would always say yes, because maybe this time would be the time I'd feel something different, something like inclusion, something like home. This year, the message came from my cousin Abby. "Thanksgiving's at Uncle Ron's again," she wrote. "You should totally come. Grandma would love it." It was brief but polite. I told myself it was a real invitation. I bought a flight. I baked my mom's favorite pumpkin bread. I even found an old scarf she used to wear around the holidays and packed it in my carry-on. The house was warm when I arrived, familiar, smelled like clove and cinnamon. There were the usual hugs, the polite smiles, the obligatory compliments on how I hadn't aged a day. I stood in the hallway, holding my coat longer than I needed to, waiting to be directed where to go. No one said anything. Eventually, I found a spot in the corner of the living room, next to a bookshelf I remembered dusting off as a kid. Plates passed by me, conversations flowed around me. I was there, but not really. When it came time for the meal, There weren't quite enough chairs at the dining table. Someone pulled a folding chair from the garage. Guess who it was for? I tried not to let it sting. I reminded myself it wasn't personal. But then the toast began. Uncle Ron stood with his glass raised, thanking everyone who had helped prepare the meal. He named each person, one by one, even Abby's new boyfriend, who'd been dating her for all of 2 weeks. He thanked his siblings, his kids, his neighbors, even the couple from down the street who had brought a pie. Then, with the same calm voice, the same smile he used every year, he looked across the table, caught my eyes, and said that not everyone who shows up belongs. Some people, he said, have made their choices. The room fell silent. No one looked at me. The clinking of glasses followed like punctuation. And just like that, I was erased. But here's the truth. You don't get to decide who I am with a single sentence. You don't get to rewrite my place in this family just because I made a different life in a different state. You don't get to silence me anymore, because I've found my voice, and I'm going to use it. What came after that moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And I'm going to take you with me through every step of what came next. Because this is not just a story about exclusion. It's a story about boundaries, awakening, and the quiet power of walking away from people who never truly saw you. And if you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, you're not alone. I wasn't always aware that I was on the outside. For most of my childhood, I just thought I was different, quieter maybe, or more sensitive. I didn't have the same energy as my cousins who seemed born with unspoken rules they all instinctively followed. I was the only one who didn't live nearby. The only one who came from a split home, as they called it when they thought I couldn't hear. When my mom moved us to Colorado after the divorce, I was 7 years old. She told me it was for work, a better job, a fresh start. But I knew there was more to it. There had been long nights of arguments before she packed our things. My father stayed behind in Illinois, and though we saw him during school breaks and alternating holidays, the distance was more than just physical. It was emotional. And it didn't take long for me to feel like we had been quietly deleted from the family narrative. Holidays were the only times we re-entered the picture, and even then, we were a temporary fixture. My mom tried. She would send cards, birthday gifts, handwritten notes. She'd call my aunts and uncles, ask about the cousins, try to stay involved. But the responses were always delayed, often vague. I learned early that showing up didn't always mean being welcomed. Still, I held tightly to the moments when I felt seen. My grandmother, for example, was always kind in her way. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings to ask about school or comment on how tall I'd grown. But even her warmth had a limit. It stopped at the surface, polite, measured, safe. What stung the most weren't the big slights. It was the accumulation of small ones. The way I was always asked to take the group photo, never to be in it. The way I'd learn about family milestones weeks after they happened, usually through a social media post or a secondhand comment. The way my birthday was acknowledged with a generic message, while my cousin Abby's included a video montage and group dinner. When I was in high school, I started to feel the weight of it more deeply. I'd scroll through photos of gatherings I hadn't even known were happening. The captions always said, "whole family," even when I wasn't there. I began to wonder what I had done wrong. I told myself maybe it was because we lived far away. Maybe they just didn't know how to include me. I excused it over and over again, shaping the narrative to protect myself from the truth, that I was simply easier to leave out. After my mom passed, everything changed, not all at once. Grief has a way of creating pauses before it rearranges everything you thought was stable. But little by little, the distance that had always been there turned into silence. There was no call from my aunt when the anniversary of Mom's death came around. No message on the day I graduated with my degree in restoration design. No one came when I opened my studio. I told myself they were busy, that people drift, that I shouldn't expect much. And maybe that's the most painful part, how naturally I accepted it, how easily I believed that their neglect was something I had to manage, not question. I think part of me still hoped that if I worked harder, stayed in touch more consistently, sent gifts, remembered their birthdays, asked the right questions, maybe they'd see me again. Maybe I'd stop being invisible. That hope followed me into adulthood. Even as I built a life of my own, independent, creative, self-sustained, I kept a drawer full of cards I never sent, photos I never framed, traditions I tried to keep alive by myself. I was loyal to a version of family that didn't really exist anymore, or maybe never had. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. I was always reaching, and they were always just far enough out of reach. But I never let go. I convinced myself that love meant trying, no matter how many times I was ignored. That family meant forgiveness, no matter how many times I was forgotten. So when Abby texted me this year, asking if I was coming to Thanksgiving, I felt something light up inside me. I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe my presence would matter. I booked the ticket the same day. I baked my mom's pumpkin bread, her favorite recipe, the one she used to say tasted like home. I packed the scarf she wore every holiday, hoping it might bring me closer to her, and maybe closer to the people we used to share those holidays with. I arrived at Uncle Ron's house with a quiet excitement buzzing under my skin. I wanted to believe I was walking into a space where I would finally be included, not tolerated. But as soon as I walked through the door, the old script played out like it always had. There were no hugs of genuine warmth, no "we missed you," just polite smiles, distracted eyes, conversations I wasn't invited into. It was like stepping into a play I hadn't been given the lines for. And then came the folding chair, the makeshift seat at the end of the table. A perfect metaphor for my place in this family, present but not considered. Still, I told myself to be grateful. I reminded myself that being here at all was a win, that I had chosen to show up, and that meant something. I tried to engage. I asked questions. I laughed when they laughed. I passed dishes and offered seconds. I watched from the periphery, heart open, waiting for a moment to feel connected. And then the toast happened. What I had feared most, the confirmation that I was never truly part of the circle, arrived not as a storm, but as a simple public dismissal. The words were quiet, but the impact was thunderous. But what I understand now, after years of trying to be chosen, is this: the people who make you feel like you have to earn your place will never give it to you freely. And the longer you stay at a table where you're only half seen, the more you shrink. That Thanksgiving wasn't the first time I felt unwelcome. It was just the first time they said it out loud. And now, there's no going back. Looking back, I can see it clearly now. That last Thanksgiving where I still thought I belonged. The clues were everywhere, even then. The hesitations, the awkward silences, the way certain glances slid past me as if I were standing behind glass. But at the time, I didn't want to see it. I had convinced myself that love meant patience, that loyalty would one day be enough to re-earn my place. That Thanksgiving was held at my aunt's house, the same house where I had spent so many childhood holidays, chasing my cousins down carpeted hallways, falling asleep under coats piled on guest beds. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I arrived with a bottle of wine I had carefully chosen, my mother's signature cranberry sauce recipe, and a heart wide open, hoping this might be the year I reconnected for real. I remember stepping into the kitchen, offering to help, but being gently redirected. I stood by the fridge for several minutes before realizing no one would ask me to stay. I wandered into the living room, hovering by the fireplace, smiling at conversations I wasn't part of, watching as my cousins talked over each other with stories I didn't know. When I finally sat on the arm of a couch, no one shifted to make room. It wasn't overt hostility. That would have been easier to confront. It was apathy, practiced, polite, and more effective than any outburst could have been. It was the deliberate absence of invitation, a kind of selective forgetfulness that spoke louder than any words ever could. My plate that year felt heavier than usual, not because of the food, but because of the silence. I sat near the end of the table again, but at least this time I had a real chair. The conversation floated over me in waves. Mentions of recent gatherings, birthdays I hadn't known about, inside jokes that hadn't included me in years. I laughed along anyway, as if my agreement could somehow insert me into the memory retroactively. That was the first time I noticed the shift in Abby, the cousin who had once been like a sister to me. She barely looked my way that year. At one point, she leaned in to whisper something to her boyfriend, and they both turned to glance at me. I smiled reflexively, even though I felt the sting. After dinner, everyone moved into the family room. Someone started a card game. Others migrated to the kitchen island for pie and second rounds of wine. I lingered in the hallway, waiting for a signal that I was wanted in either group. None came. I sat in a corner chair by the window and watched as laughter echoed without me. When I eventually stood to say my goodbyes, no one really protested. There were quick hugs, distracted thank yous, and a general sense that my presence or absence would have no effect on the rest of the night. I walked out into the cold evening air feeling like I had been a placeholder, a shadow of someone they used to know, but no longer remembered how to love. I cried in the car that night, not because anything cruel had happened, but because everything kind had been withheld, and somehow that felt worse. It was the realization that I wasn't hated. I was just optional, replaceable, forgotten. For weeks afterward, I tried to shake the feeling. I replayed moments in my mind, wondering if I had said the wrong thing, worn the wrong outfit, brought the wrong pie. I dissected everything as if I could find a cause that would justify the effect. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't about something I had done. It was about the role I had stopped playing. I wasn't the one who called regularly. I wasn't in their group texts or at their Sunday dinners. I wasn't someone they expected anymore. And instead of trying to close that distance, they simply adjusted around it. Erased me from the routine with soft edges and warm smiles. I was no longer missed, just absent. That realization broke something in me. For a while, I pulled back. I skipped Easter. I let birthdays pass without calls. I didn't send a card when Abby got engaged, even though I had always been the one to remember dates. I thought maybe they'd notice. Maybe someone would reach out, ask if I was okay, wonder where I'd gone. But no one did. There were no check-ins, no messages. The silence I had offered was met with deeper silence in return. And yet, part of me clung to the hope that it was just a phase, that families drift sometimes and come back together, that maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for me to break the ice again. So when the next Thanksgiving rolled around and Abby texted me, brief, polite, detached, I jumped at the chance. I told myself it was a sign, a reset, proof that I hadn't been completely forgotten. I ignored the fact that her message didn't include warmth. I dismissed how late the invite came, how it lacked the enthusiasm I used to hear in her voice. I told myself a seat at the table was all I needed, even if it came with a folding chair and no place card, because I still believed that showing up meant something. I wish I could say that last Thanksgiving had ended with hope, that I'd left with some small sign that I was on my way back into the fold. But the truth is, I left feeling smaller than I ever had. It was the moment I finally began to understand that no amount of effort on my part would rewrite the roles they had already assigned me. I was no longer the niece they celebrated. I was the one who had moved away, the one who didn't come around often enough, the one who was easier to forget. And though I couldn't fully accept it at the time, that Thanksgiving was my warning, a quiet signal of what was coming. The next one would be louder. The next one would leave no room for interpretation. When the invitation came, if I can even call it that, I told myself it meant something. It wasn't warm, and it wasn't particularly thoughtful. Just a short message from Abby saying, "Uncle Ron's hosting again this year. You should come." No exclamation point. No, "we'd love to see you." Just a suggestion offered out of obligation or convenience. But I accepted it as a sign, a signal that maybe I hadn't been erased entirely. I booked the flight the same evening, choosing an early departure so I'd have time to settle in before dinner. I even splurged on a rental car, wanting to arrive at the house on my own terms, not as a passenger, not as an afterthought. I needed something to feel like a decision I had made, not one I was given. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, I kept telling myself this year would be different, that the quiet exclusions of the past had been circumstantial, not intentional, that maybe my family just didn't know how much their distance had hurt me. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I always had. I spent hours deciding what to wear, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel grounded, confident. I chose a soft green sweater my mother had once complimented, a pair of black boots I had saved up to buy. I even packed the scarf she used to wear during the holidays, a faded cranberry red with tiny stitched stars along the edges. It smelled faintly of lavender, and wrapping it around my neck made me feel a little less alone. I baked pumpkin bread using her recipe, the same one I'd brought to every Thanksgiving since I was old enough to measure flour. It wasn't fancy, but it meant something. It was my way of contributing, of holding on to a piece of her, and maybe, in some small way, a piece of belonging. On the morning of my flight, I woke up before the alarm. The house was quiet, dim with early light filtering through the blinds. I moved through my routine in silence, packing carefully, checking and rechecking my bags. There was a nervous flutter in my chest, a strange combination of excitement and dread that I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was normal, that anyone would feel this way returning to a space they hadn't fully trusted in years. The airport was crowded but familiar. I kept my headphones in, avoiding small talk, focused on my own thoughts. I tried not to overthink it, but everything felt symbolic. The way I moved through security with ease, the way the plane lifted off into gray skies, the way the world below me shrank until it no longer resembled anything I recognized. The flight was uneventful. I spent most of it staring out the window, imagining how it would go. In my mind, I replayed the evening as I wanted it to be. Warm greetings, shared stories, maybe even a few apologies. I pictured myself laughing with my cousins, catching up on life, passing dishes and being part of something again. I clung to that version, even though a quieter voice inside me warned against it. When I landed, the wind was sharp, colder than I had remembered. I picked up the rental car, a compact gray sedan with a humming engine and the faint scent of peppermint. As I drove toward Uncle Ron's house, I felt that familiar tension build, a tightening in my chest, a shortening of breath. It wasn't fear exactly, more like grief layered with hope. I wasn't sure which one would win. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. The same trees, now bare and reaching. The same mailbox with the faded numbers. The same driveway where I'd once played hopscotch with Abby and James. It was strange how memory could be both a comfort and a weapon, depending on how you looked at it. When I pulled up, there were already several cars parked along the street. I recognized them all. My heart beat faster. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting my scarf, smoothing my hair. I didn't want to look fragile. I didn't want to look like someone desperate to be accepted. I walked up the path slowly, the familiar sound of fallen leaves crunching under my boots. I rang the doorbell, though I knew I didn't need to. I always rang, always waited to be let in. The door opened after a long pause, and there was my uncle. Same broad frame, same tired eyes, same neutral smile. He stepped aside to let me in without much fanfare. Behind him, the house was full of motion. Voices in the kitchen, laughter from the living room, the clatter of dishes being arranged. I stepped inside, the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey wrapping around me. For a second, it felt almost normal. But then I noticed the looks. Not cruel, just surprised. As if no one had really expected me to come. No one reached out to take the bread I had brought. I held it awkwardly as I removed my coat. Someone eventually pointed me toward the kitchen, where I placed it on the far edge of the counter, beside a tray of untouched appetizers. No one commented. No one asked what it was. The house was warm, but I felt cold. I hovered near the kitchen for a while, then moved toward the living room, where a group of cousins sat curled on couches, deep in conversation. They glanced up when I entered, offered polite nods, and then returned to their stories. No space was made, no question was asked. I retreated to the hallway, clutching my scarf like a lifeline. The noise around me felt distant, like I was hearing it through thick glass. I wondered if anyone noticed how long I stood there, or if my absence was as unremarkable as my presence had always been. When dinner was finally announced, we filtered toward the long table. It was beautiful, candles flickering, name cards delicately placed. I scanned the table, looking for mine. It wasn't there. A folding chair had been added to the far end, a paper napkin placed in lieu of a name. I sat in silence and waited for something I couldn't name. The table was already full when I sat down. Not just with food, but with unspoken alliances. Every seat had been claimed, not just physically, but emotionally. These were seats earned over time, through proximity, routine, and the comfort of being known. I had no such claim. I had the folding chair at the corner, where the end of the table curved toward the hallway, just far enough that I had to lean forward to hear what was being said. The napkin beside my plate was different, thinner, more like a cocktail napkin than the heavy linen ones the others had. My glass had water in it, while the others had already been poured wine. I watched as hands reached across for dishes, for rolls and gravy boats and second helpings, and I noticed how rarely any of them moved toward me. I told myself it didn't matter. I smiled when someone made a joke, even if I wasn't sure what the joke was about. I passed the sweet potatoes and tried to compliment the turkey. But there was a rhythm to the table that I couldn't seem to catch. My words felt delayed, like a second language speaker just a beat behind. No one was cruel, but no one invited me in. The meal moved forward, the conversations growing louder as the wine flowed. Laughter rose from different pockets of the table, familiar laughter, the kind that comes from shared histories and inside stories. I kept my posture straight, my face soft, my hands folded gently in my lap. I told myself this was enough, that I was here, that it counted. As the plates cleared, someone brought out a pie. 2 pies, actually. One was pumpkin, the other pecan. I had brought neither, and mine was never unwrapped. It remained on the kitchen counter, a quiet witness to my place in this gathering. Still untouched, still unacknowledged. Dessert plates clinked softly as they were handed out. People leaned in closer now, full and relaxed. The candles flickered, casting soft light across the faces around me. It was the moment I had always thought I wanted, to be part of the family in their most unguarded state. But all I could feel was the slow, spreading awareness that I didn't belong here anymore, if I ever had. And then, like a cue from a play I hadn't auditioned for, my uncle stood. He tapped his glass with the edge of a butter knife, and the room fell into a hush. Even the children stopped moving. Everyone turned to him, expectant, smiling. This was his moment, his tradition, really. He always gave the Thanksgiving toast. He started, as he always did, by thanking everyone for coming, for contributing, for cooking, for simply being there. He listed names, made small jokes, earned warm laughter and nods of agreement. He thanked Abby and James for helping set the table. He thanked his wife for putting up with all of us. He even thanked the neighbors across the street who had dropped off a bottle of wine earlier that day. I waited quietly for my name. It didn't come. Instead, he shifted his tone slightly, still smiling, still warm. But there was something new in his voice, something firmer. He spoke of showing up, of earning your place at the table. He spoke of consistency and how family was more than just blood. It was about being present, about being involved, about belonging through action, not expectation. And then he looked at me, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with something far worse, finality. He raised his glass higher and said the words that hollowed me out from the inside. Without ever saying my name, he made it clear I wasn't part of what he was toasting, that I hadn't earned the place I was sitting in, that my presence here was a courtesy, not a given. There was no gasp, no protest, just the sound of glasses rising all around me. Everyone toasted, everyone drank, and then the moment passed as if it had been nothing. But for me, it was everything. I sat there, still holding my fork as the room slowly returned to normal, as the conversations resumed, as laughter returned like waves brushing away footprints. I stared down at my dessert plate, now empty, and felt a coldness crawl up my spine. No one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. No one even seemed to register that anything unusual had been said. But I knew. I knew that the line had been drawn. This wasn't passive neglect anymore. This was active erasure, made palatable through politeness, made public through a toast. My heart beat fast, but my face remained still. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing the impact. I sat through the rest of dessert with the numbness of someone watching themselves from far away. I nodded. I smiled when appropriate. I cleared my plate and thanked whoever was near. Then I walked to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. My reflection didn't look different, but everything inside me had changed. There was no fixing this, no gentle conversation that could undo the weight of what had just happened. I had been publicly dismissed, and everyone had silently agreed. When I stepped back out, coats were being gathered, dishes stacked. The evening was winding down. I moved toward the front door quietly, slipped my coat on without a word, and stepped outside into the cold. No one followed. No one called after me. And for the first time, I didn't wait for someone to. The drive back to my hotel was quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of silence that hums beneath your skin. Not the silence of calm, but of something cracking under pressure. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. Not out of fear, but because I needed something to hold on to. Something that wouldn't let go of me as easily as they had. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just sat with it. The weight of the moment still fresh, still hot against my chest like a burn that hadn't fully blistered. My uncle's toast kept playing in my head, looping without mercy. The words weren't even cruel. That was the part that haunted me most. They were just certain, confident, like he truly believed them. Like everyone else did too. When I reached the parking lot, I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before I could make myself move. The engine off. The world outside blurry through the frost-covered windshield. Inside, I was frozen in a different way. Numb, but vibrating. Cold, but flushed. I finally gathered my things, walked into the hotel, and made it to my room without remembering the steps. It was like moving underwater. Everything slow, muffled, surreal. I turned on a lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. The scarf my mother used to wear was still wrapped around my neck. I reached up, unwound it gently, and held it in my lap like something sacred. That's when the tears started. They weren't loud. They didn't come in waves. They came slowly, steady and sharp, as if my body had been waiting for permission, for release. Each tear carried something, a memory, a small hurt I hadn't let myself name, a question I had never dared to ask. They slid down my cheeks in silence, disappearing into the fabric of my sweater like secrets. I thought of every Thanksgiving that came before, the ones where I arrived full of hope and left carrying some invisible bruise, the ones where I tried too hard, smiled too much, said the right things, and still left feeling like a stranger in my own skin. And I thought about how long I had allowed that to continue, how deeply I had convinced myself that belonging was something I could earn, if I just proved I was worth it. But that night, sitting on the edge of a bed in a generic hotel room, I understood something I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. They had never seen me as one of them. Not really. I was a guest in their traditions, a footnote in their stories, a name they remembered to include only when it was convenient, never when it was vital. And that toast, that single casual statement delivered with a raised glass, was the confirmation I hadn't wanted but had always feared. It was the final puzzle piece snapping into place, the proof that the exclusion I had felt wasn't imagined. It had been real, consistent, deliberate. There had been no mistake, no oversight, just a decision, spoken aloud for the first time, but lived out for years. I sat there, letting that truth settle deep inside me, like snow falling on a roof that had long since collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet devastation, the kind that strips away every illusion you've wrapped yourself in. And in that clarity, something else began to take shape. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. The realization that I had spent years begging for scraps of connection from people who had no intention of feeding me anything real, that I had shaped myself around their comfort, dimmed my light to make space, quieted my own voice so theirs could echo louder, all in the hope that one day they'd see me again, hear me, choose me. But they hadn't, and they wouldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't belong at that table. Not because I wasn't family. By blood, I was. But because I had stopped performing the role they had written for me long ago. I had grown outside their story. I had built a life that didn't rely on their approval. And in doing so, I had made myself unfamiliar, uncomfortable, unwelcome. That was the unspoken rule I had broken. I had changed. And they had chosen not to adapt. As the hours passed, I began to feel the edges of my sadness harden into something stronger. Not bitterness, but boundaries. Not revenge, but reclamation. I wouldn't try to fix it anymore. I wouldn't write long messages explaining how I felt. I wouldn't show up next year with pumpkin bread and hope stitched into every slice. I wouldn't ask them to see me, because I had finally seen myself, not as the forgotten niece, not as the one on the folding chair, but as someone who had the strength to stand alone when necessary, as someone who deserved more than a half-hearted invite and a backhanded toast. That night, I didn't sleep much. I watched the sun begin to rise over the parking lot, light bleeding into the room slowly. And for the first time in years, I felt no urgency to return to them. No pressure to apologize for the space I took up. No guilt for the decisions I knew I would make next. I packed my things with a strange calm, folded the scarf carefully, and placed it in my bag. I checked out before the front desk was fully staffed. The drive to the airport was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was still. Like the inside of a snow globe after the flakes have settled. By the time I boarded the plane home, I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about me. When I landed back in Denver, the sky was gray and the wind sharp, but something inside me had settled. Not in the way peace settles, soft and comforting, but in the way concrete dries after being poured. Cold, firm, final. I turned my phone off airplane mode, and the screen lit up with a flood of notifications. Missed calls, voicemails, a few vague texts from cousins, one from my aunt, even a message from my father. Just a time-stamped voicemail, no transcript, no emotion. I didn't listen to any of them. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew what they were going to say. They had seen me leave. They had watched me walk out without a scene, without protest, without ceremony. And now, suddenly, they wanted to know how I was. Now that the damage was visible. Now that I had made it impossible to ignore. But I wasn't going to reward their silence with explanations. I wasn't going to teach them how to care about me. Not anymore. At home, I carried my bag into the kitchen, set it on the floor, and sat at the small wooden table by the window. The scarf was still in my coat pocket. I didn't take it out. I wasn't ready to touch it again. Not yet. Instead, I stared at the empty chair across from me. The one no one had ever taken from me. The one I never had to earn. And I realized how different it felt to be alone by choice. The first few days passed like fog. I moved through them slowly, like someone adjusting to a new kind of quiet. My phone stayed off for hours at a time. I checked emails only when necessary. I let voicemails pile up untouched. The house felt like a sanctuary again, not a holding cell for my disappointment, but a place where I could finally be with myself, unobserved, unjudged, uninterrupted. I didn't cry, not anymore. The tears had already done their work. What remained now was something harder, something stronger, the absence of longing. For the first time in years, I didn't want to fix it. I didn't want to send a carefully worded message or initiate a call or smooth the discomfort for their sake. I didn't want to reach for them at all. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. I began to feel free. The guilt that had been stitched into my body for so long, guilt for living far away, for missing birthdays, for not being more involved, began to unravel, thread by thread, until all that was left was the truth. I had shown up, again and again, and they had looked right through me. One afternoon, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos. Not the ones from the dinner. I would never look at those again. But older ones, childhood snapshots, me and Abby in matching pajamas, me standing next to Uncle Ron holding a fishing pole, my mother sitting on a picnic blanket, laughing in the sun. I lingered on one picture, Thanksgiving, probably 1996. I was around 6 years old, perched on the bottom step of my aunt's staircase, holding a slice of pie in both hands like it was a trophy. Everyone else was in the background, blurry, in motion, but I was still, focused, there, present. That's what hurt the most. I had always been there. From the beginning. Even when I wasn't seen. Even when I had to fight for scraps of attention. I had never stopped trying. But now I had stopped. The messages kept coming. Some were apologetic in tone. Others were defensive, full of veiled reproaches and passive language. Sorry you felt that way. It wasn't meant like that. I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. The usual parade of phrases designed not to take responsibility, but to soften the blow of having delivered it. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't owe them my pain wrapped in palatable explanations. I didn't owe them closure. They had created a story where I was the one who drifted, where I was the one who chose distance, and I had played that role long enough. I wasn't going to offer them a new script now, not one that painted me as the wounded, waiting figure ready to forgive just because they finally noticed I was missing. I was done. I deleted the messages after reading them once, blocked numbers that insisted on repeating themselves, removed myself from the group chat where holiday plans were being recycled without my name. I untethered myself piece by piece, gently but thoroughly. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain my absence. I let it be loud. I let my silence speak in a way my presence never had. It was strange at first, not reaching out. Strange not being the one to smooth things over, to offer the benefit of the doubt, to be the bridge between broken parts. But in that strangeness, there was also relief, because I had been carrying that responsibility for too long, and it had never once been reciprocated. I started filling my evenings with things that fed me. Books I hadn't had time to finish, walks through the nearby nature trails, long baths without a clock ticking beside me. I rediscovered the pleasure of making dinner just for myself. I drank wine with no one to impress. I lit candles for no reason. I stopped asking for permission to enjoy my own company. Eventually, the calls slowed. The messages stopped. The family calendar continued without me, its updates shrinking into silence. And I let it. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not show up, not explain, not plead for inclusion. Sometimes walking away isn't a retreat, it's a reclamation. And that's exactly what I was doing. The silence didn't last forever. It never does. At first, it was quiet in the way winter mornings are, still, expectant, oddly beautiful. But then, slowly, the noise returned. Not all at once, just little echoes, testing the walls I had begun to build. The first was an email from my cousin. Polite, casual, almost breezy. She said she hoped I was well and that she had been meaning to check in. She didn't mention the toast. She didn't mention Thanksgiving. Just an open-ended invitation to catch up sometime. I read the message twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. It was a test, a feeler, a way to measure how deep the silence really went. I didn't respond. A week later came a letter, actual paper, postmarked and handwritten, from my aunt, neat cursive on floral stationery, the kind she used for thank you notes and condolences. She filled the page with soft words, nostalgia, and memories. She reminisced about Thanksgivings from years past, about my mother's laughter, about the time I helped her peel a mountain of potatoes when I was 10. But again, no mention of what had happened. No reference to the chair, the toast, the very public exiling. Just a gentle tug on the past. A request for me to come back to a version of the family that no longer existed, or perhaps never had. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready to throw it away. Yet I knew I couldn't answer it either. Not when the words danced around what needed to be said. Not when the only apology offered was through omission. Then came the call from my father, missed at first, then another, then a voicemail. Not rushed, not panicked, just his usual tone, controlled, diplomatic, asking if we could talk, if we could move past this. He didn't say what this was, but I knew. Everyone knew. It was the family version of damage control, the moment when the absence becomes harder to ignore than the presence ever was, when the weight of your silence shifts the dynamic, and they realize the role you once played can't be filled by anyone else, not because you were so indispensable, but because your tolerance had allowed everything else to function smoothly. And now, without it, there were cracks. Cracks in the stories they told each other. Cracks in the assumption that I'd always come back. Cracks in the version of events they were trying to preserve. I didn't answer that call either, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had nothing to say that would satisfy him. Nothing that would make this easier for him to digest. The truth rarely is, but the pressure grew. More calls. This time from my mother's sister, who had always positioned herself as the bridge. Her messages came with guilt veiled as care, concern wrapped in reprimand. She didn't understand why I was being so cold. She said families have to move on after hard moments. She said things were getting better now, as if healing could happen without acknowledgement. as if I could simply rejoin the group like nothing had ever been broken. That was the moment I realized something important. They weren't reaching out to understand. They were reaching out to reset. They wanted the version of me who smiled through discomfort, who showed up with gifts and stories and made it easy to forget how hard it had been to be forgotten. They wanted the woman who forgave without consequence, who swallowed the silence and called it love. But that woman didn't live here anymore, and I wasn't going to trade my clarity for inclusion ever again. So I began to respond, but not in the way they expected. I didn't send long explanations or dramatic declarations. I didn't rehash the toast or name the pain. Instead, I replied with calm, firm boundaries. I said I was taking space, that I wasn't ready to re-engage, that healing, for me, didn't look like pretending. It looked like solitude, like reflection, like rebuilding from the inside out. Some accepted it, others didn't. There were accusations, quiet ones, passive-aggressive ones, the kind wrapped in concern but dripping with disappointment. I was being dramatic. I was overreacting. I was making things harder than they needed to be. I let those comments land where they may. I didn't catch them. I didn't carry them. Because I knew now that my worth didn't come from their approval. It came from the fact that I was finally treating myself with the care I had always given away so freely. And in that quiet, new things began to grow. Connections I had neglected out of obligation to the old ones. Friends who had been patiently waiting on the edges of my life, ready to step in when I was ready to receive something real. One of them, a woman I had met in a local community book club, became a weekly presence. Someone who didn't need a history to understand my story. She brought soup one night and said nothing about what had happened. She just sat with me on the couch and passed me the remote. It was the simplest thing, and it meant everything. I started journaling again, not for an audience, not for clarity, just for release, just to say the things that had been trapped in my chest for too long. And through it, I began to find my voice again, not the one I had trained to be polite and pleasing, but the one that came from my gut, steady, honest, unapologetic. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped writing scripts for people who had already walked off stage. Instead, I started writing one for myself. And for the first time, I liked the story I was telling. It didn't include a perfect resolution. It didn't tie everything up with a ribbon. But it was mine, authored by me, lived by me. And that was enough. The door they had closed wasn't mine to reopen. But I had no intention of standing outside it anymore, waiting for someone to hear me knock. There's something strange about healing, how quietly it begins. Not with grand declarations or sweeping resolutions, but with small shifts. A morning where the air feels just a little softer. A moment when you realize you didn't wake up carrying the same weight on your chest. A breath that goes all the way in. For me, it started with light. The way it moved across my kitchen floor one Tuesday morning. Golden, patient, undemanding. I stood there, barefoot, a mug of tea warming my hands, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the urge to fill the silence. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't scroll through pictures I no longer appeared in. I just stood still and breathed. That moment didn't fix anything, but it changed everything. I began to anchor myself in those small, steady things. My morning routine became sacred, not rushed or distracted, but intentional. I made breakfast with both hands. I read with focus. I worked without music blaring in the background. I moved through the day like I was trying to meet myself again. And in a way, I was. Because for so long, I had been performing a version of myself that fit the expectations of others. The one who forgave quickly, who never took up too much space, who always showed up even when no one asked her to. That version had been exhausted for years. She was tired of bending, tired of explaining, tired of shrinking to fit into rooms that only welcomed her if she stayed quiet. Now, I wasn't performing anymore. I was choosing what to give my time to, choosing who to share my energy with, choosing how to tell my story, not through bitterness or victimhood, but through clarity, through ownership, through boundaries that no longer needed permission to exist. It wasn't easy. Grief never is. Because that's what it was. Not just grief for what happened at the dinner table, but for everything that led to it. For the little girl who used to pack her suitcase with excitement before visiting her cousins. For the young woman who bought gifts no one remembered. For the adult who kept showing up hoping someone would finally see her. I had to mourn her. And I did. Some days the grief came in waves, sudden and sharp. Triggered by a smell, a song, a memory that hadn't yet been rewritten by distance. Other days it was dull, a low ache that lived in the background like static. But over time, the grief began to move. It didn't disappear, but it stopped defining me. That was the biggest change, because for a while, the pain had become part of my identity. The exclusion, the rejection, the quiet humiliation, they had carved their names into my reflection. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who had been left behind. Now, I was learning to see someone who had walked away, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Not because she wasn't invited, but because she finally understood the cost of constantly trying to be. There was freedom in that shift. I started spending more time with people who made me feel like I didn't need to explain myself. Friends who didn't ask for details, but offered presence. Strangers who became safe places. The woman at the coffee shop who remembered my order. The elderly neighbor who waved every morning and sometimes left flowers by my gate. The small interactions that built something steady, a quiet foundation of connection that didn't require history to feel real. I began writing again, not about the family, not about the dinner, but about other things. Beauty, resilience, how wood changes color over time, how sunlight softens sharp corners, how healing isn't linear, but spirals inward and outward like tree rings. I filled notebooks without editing myself, without trying to sound okay, just writing what was true. That became my ritual. Every night, a candle lit, a pen in hand, a page waiting. And slowly, my story began to unfold in a new direction. There were setbacks, of course, days when I missed them, not for who they were, but for who I had hoped they might become. I missed the version of family I had created in my mind, the one that showed up, reached out, held space. Letting go of that fantasy was painful, but it was necessary, because holding on to it had only ever led to disappointment, and I had no room left for disappointment, only for truth, only for things that grew. The lake, not far from my home, became a place of refuge. I walked its edge every weekend, sometimes with music, sometimes with silence. I watched as the seasons changed, the leaves falling, the water freezing, then slowly softening into spring. Each week, the shoreline reminded me that transformation doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. It just needs time and space. One morning, as I stood at the edge of the dock, I realized I felt proud. Not because I had overcome some huge tragedy. Not because I had delivered some speech or forced reconciliation. But because I had chosen not to betray myself. Because when faced with the choice to remain small and accepted, or step into truth and risk being alone, I chose the latter. And I was still here, whole, wiser, no longer waiting for someone else to tell me I belonged. I belonged because I had chosen to stay with myself, because I had stopped abandoning myself to be loved by people who didn't know how to love me, because I had survived the silence and made it my own. And now, when I wake up each morning, I no longer check my phone for validation. I no longer reread messages hoping for warmth. I no longer measure my worth by the proximity of people who once made me feel invisible. I measure it by peace, by quiet joy, by the steady, unwavering truth that I am enough. Not because they finally saw me, but because I finally do. There's a quiet power in choosing yourself. It's not loud or performative. It doesn't require confrontation or final words. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look around and realize you no longer ache to be invited in. You've stopped waiting for an apology that isn't coming. You've stopped hoping that the people who hurt you will someday understand the impact of their silence. That's where I was, almost exactly a year after my uncle raised his glass at Thanksgiving and told a room full of relatives that I didn't belong there. For months after that moment, I replayed it over and over in my head, trying to decipher if it had really happened the way I remembered. But it had. I hadn't misheard it or misunderstood it or exaggerated it in my mind. He said it. And worse, no one had come to my defense. That was the moment I stopped chasing approval. I didn't go to Christmas. I didn't show up for birthdays or baby showers. When my mother sent half-hearted messages about trying to move past it, I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I was finally listening to myself. I was tired of minimizing my own discomfort for the sake of appearances. Tired of pretending the slow erosion of my place in that family wasn't happening. Healing didn't arrive like a wave. It came in fragments. A walk around the lake without checking my phone. A night in with a good book and no lingering guilt. A call from a friend who reminded me that chosen families are real and often more consistent than the ones you're born into. Around April, I began to reclaim things that made me feel grounded. I redecorated the guest bedroom, not because anyone was coming to visit, but because I wanted to make space for comfort, not obligation. I started planting herbs in the windowsill. I changed my phone wallpaper to a quote that said, "You don't have to sit at a table where love is conditional." Every time I looked at it, I felt stronger. When summer came, I spent weekends hosting small dinners for people who made me feel seen. Some of them had known me for years. Others were new, friends of friends who brought laughter and stories and warmth. We sat around mismatched chairs, passed wine bottles back and forth, and no one expected me to shrink. I hadn't realized how much I used to shrink. By the time fall arrived, I no longer braced for the holidays. I didn't dread the invitations or lack thereof. I didn't hover near my phone, waiting for someone to ask if I'd be coming home. I had stopped thinking of that house as home a long time ago. Instead, I planned my own Thanksgiving. I didn't call it a statement. I didn't advertise it to relatives or post cryptic captions online. I just invited people who made me feel whole. Friends, neighbors, 2 coworkers who didn't want to spend the day alone. We cooked together, danced in the kitchen, and ate until we were full, not just with food, but with each other. When I cleared the table that night, I looked around at the crumbs and the empty plates and the warm lighting, and I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Peace. Not revenge, not righteousness, just peace. I had built something for myself, not a fortress or a wall to keep others out, but a space where I didn't have to question my value, where I didn't have to earn my right to exist, where no one could take my seat away because I had made it with my own hands. Forgiveness came quietly, but it didn't look like reconciliation. I forgave them for not seeing me. I forgave myself for wanting to be seen by people who never looked too closely. I forgave the younger version of me who begged to be let in, even when the door was clearly locked. That forgiveness wasn't a bridge back to them. It was a bridge back to me. I thought about my uncle sometimes, not with hatred, just with clarity. He had likely spoken aloud what others only thought, that I was too much, too different. too loud in my independence and inconvenient in my existence. I didn't need to fix that. I only needed to stop asking for permission to be myself. A few family members reached out throughout the year. Some offered apologies that lacked depth. Some simply wanted to pretend nothing had happened. But the door they once had access to was no longer open by default. I had learned to ask different questions. Not, do they love me, but do they treat me with care? Not, am I invited, but do I feel safe there? And when I stopped waiting for them to make room for me, I realized I had all the room I needed. This chapter of my life didn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a sweeping reconciliation. It ended with soft music playing over candlelight. It ended with dishes in the sink and friends lounging on the couch. It ended with me smiling to myself as I folded a linen napkin and realized I had finally come home, to myself. So if you're still here, thank you. Thank you for listening, for making it all the way to the end of this story, for holding space for someone else's pain and transformation. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, I hope this reminded you that you absolutely do. You belong, you matter, and you don't need anyone else's permission to claim your place. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need these words today. And if you made it to the end, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And write, I won't shrink for anyone. Don't give up on yourself. Don't let anyone tell you who you are not. You are worthy of love, space, and peace. Be blessed. Be bold. And I'll see you in the next story.